Do you remember when Sundays smelled like pot roast and warm rolls long before takeout menus replaced handwritten recipe cards? Families would gather around the table, sharing dishes that only appeared once a week, slow cooked with care and meant to stretch for leftovers. Somewhere along the way, those meals vanished from our kitchens, tucked away in forgotten cookbooks and fading memories. Today, we're bringing them back. 30 Sunday dishes no one makes anymore, but everyone remembers. Potluck church casserole, hot dish. Cream of soup magic, the 1950s fellowship staple. There was a time when Sunday mornings meant more than hymns and pressed dresses. They carried the quiet anticipation of what would appear on the long folding tables in the fellowship hall. Dishes lined up in Pyrex and enamel, names scribbled on masking tape underneath, and almost without fail, there it was. The potluck church casserole. Known in the Midwest simply as hot dish, it was less a recipe and more a ritual, a humble layering of pantry ingredients that somehow felt sacred in its simplicity. The backbone of these casseroles was always a can of cream of something soup, mushroom, chicken, celery, poured straight from Campbell's, no questions asked. It bound together ground beef or shredded chicken, elbow macaroni, or egg noodles, a handful of peas if someone was feeling generous. On top, either crushed potato chips for crunch, or a scattering of cheddar cheese, melted into golden bliss by the church basement's ancient oven. There was no pretension here, no talk of from scratch or farm to table. It was food made to feed a crowd, stretch a paycheck, and bring comfort to people who needed it. This casserole wasn't just about taste, it was about fellowship. The women's auxiliary would set out mismatched coffee cups while kids darted between legs, and the men, ties loosened, lined up with paper plates. The first bite always brought that familiar warmth. A little salty, a little creamy, impossibly filling. In a decade defined by post-war optimism and a boom in convenience foods, this dish was both modern and deeply rooted in tradition. Today, some might scoff at the idea of canned soup cuisine. But taste one spoonful and tell me it doesn't whisper of simpler times, of potlucks where nobody cared about food trends, only that everyone had enough. It's nostalgia you can eat straight from the 9x13 pan. Would you still bring it to a potluck today? Or has that kind of humble magic vanished from our tables? Ambrosia with sour cream, canned fruit, mini marshmallows, and the South's unapologetic sweet tooth. There's a certain gleeful abandon in Southern holiday tables, where desserts sneak their way onto the dinner plate and nobody dares complain. Ambrosia salad, in all its pastel glory, is perhaps the most shameless example. Imagine opening a can of fruit cocktail. Pineapple chunks, syrupy mandarin oranges, those elusive red cherries. Draining just enough juice to keep things slippery, and then folding it together with a dollop of sour cream. Yes, sour cream. This is the secret that separates ambrosia from a fruit salad. It tames the sweetness without sacrificing the indulgence, giving each bite a tang that feels oddly sophisticated, even if the recipe came straight from the back of a 1950s church cookbook. Mini marshmallows are scattered through the mix, soft little pillows that melt ever so slightly into the fruit, creating a texture somewhere between salad and dessert. Coconut flakes, sweetened of course, cling to every bite, adding chew and a whisper of tropical fantasy to what is otherwise a proudly canned creation. It's the kind of dish that appears at Christmas dinners, Easter potlucks, and any Sunday supper where somebody's grandmother insists we need something sweet. And in the South, ambrosia isn't just tolerated, it's tradition. The name, borrowed from the food of Greek gods, always felt like a wink. Because what's more divine than a dish that takes 5 minutes, no oven, and a single mixing bowl? Children loved it because it tasted like candy. Adults claimed to love it because it reminded them of childhood. In reality, everyone loved it for the same reason. It was unapologetically fun. Today, recipes get fancier: fresh fruit, Greek yogurt, toasted coconut. But there's something honest about the canned version, the one unapologetic in its sweetness and simplicity. Taste it now and you'll understand why Southern tables still make room for it. Doesn't every holiday deserve a little pastel nostalgia? Leftover turkey croquettes with gravy. Post-holiday ingenuity turned Sunday feast. The day after a holiday feast often begins with quiet kitchens and refrigerators groaning under the weight of leftovers. Among the cold slices of turkey, congealed gravy, and half-eaten pies lies an unspoken challenge. What now? Enter the humble turkey croquette, a post-war invention of pure ingenuity that transformed scraps into Sunday-worthy fare. These golden little cylinders, crisp on the outside and creamy within, became the unsung heroes of holiday aftermaths across mid-century America. Mothers, ever resourceful, would chop leftover turkey finely, sometimes grinding it in the same hand-cranked meat grinder used for ham salad or deviled eggs. To this, they'd add mashed potatoes or quick bechamel sauce, binding the mixture with an egg, seasoning with salt, pepper, and perhaps a whisper of sage. Rolled into logs or patties, dipped in breadcrumbs and fried in shallow oil. Croquettes emerged from the skillet with a satisfying sizzle, their crusts crackling as they cooled on paper towels. The gravy, reheated on the stovetop, sometimes enriched with a splash of milk to stretch it further, was ladled generously over the croquettes, softening the crisp edges and mingling with the tender turkey within. Served alongside leftover cranberry sauce or simply a slice of white bread, it turned yesterday's feast into an entirely new meal, thrifty yet comforting. This dish wasn't about frugality alone, it was about ritual. Families gathered around the same table, the mood softer and slower than the day before. The holiday rush was over, but the flavors lingered, transformed by creativity and care. It was a reminder that nothing went to waste, and that good cooking often begins not with abundance, but with what remains. Today, croquettes feel like a relic, overtaken by sandwiches and modern meal prep. But their charm endures. One bite, with gravy dripping down your fork, and you'll taste not just turkey, but the quiet satisfaction of stretching celebration into one more day. Isn't that what Sunday cooking is all about? Cold chicken rice ring with peas, gelatin molds meet practicality. There was a period in American kitchens, particularly in the 1950s and early 1960s, when gelatin reigned supreme. Anything could be molded: fruit, vegetables, even full meals. Enter the cold chicken rice ring, a shimmering centerpiece that promised elegance and thrift in one circular package. To modernize, it may look curious, even puzzling. But to the hostesses of church luncheons and bridge clubs, it was a stroke of genius. Portable, pretty, and made entirely from pantry staples and leftover Sunday chicken. The preparation was straightforward yet undeniably theatrical. Cooked rice formed the base, its starch helping to bind shredded chicken, sweet peas, and diced celery into something more cohesive. A can of condensed chicken broth, sometimes brightened with lemon juice, was bloomed with unflavored gelatin and poured over the mixture, binding it together as it chilled in a ring mold overnight. When unmolded onto a platter, the result was a pale, quivering halo flecked with green peas, a dish that dared you not to stare. Served cold, it was practical for warm weather potlucks or post-church suppers where refrigeration was minimal and presentation mattered. Mayonnaise or a simple sour cream dressing often accompanied it, spooned generously into the hollow center of the ring for dipping. It was filling yet light, a salad and main dish in one designed to stretch a small amount of chicken into a meal for many. While gelatin salads have mostly faded from fashion, there's something undeniably charming about the cold chicken rice ring. It speaks to a time when cooks embraced innovation without irony, trusting that molded foods signaled sophistication. Today, it might raise eyebrows or start conversations at a retro-themed dinner party, but one bite reveals its logic. Tender chicken, cool rice, bursts of peas, and a whisper of savory broth. It's nostalgia you can slice. Would you dare bring it back to your table just for the thrill of watching someone's face light up or wrinkle in surprise? Jell-O salads with shredded carrots, a love letter or apology to aspic. Few dishes spark more debate or laughter at retro potluck tables than the infamous Jell-O salad studded with shredded carrots. To some, it's a cherished childhood memory. Grandma's green mold glistening on a platter, sweet and tangy, wobbly as it hit the table. To others, it's culinary penance, proof that mid-century America's love affair with gelatin occasionally went too far. Either way, this dish embodies the era's boundless optimism, when convenience foods promised modern magic and every meal needed a little sparkle. The recipe was simple, almost suspiciously so. A packet of lime Jell-O dissolved in boiling water, chilled until just thickened, then folded with grated carrots, sometimes pineapple tidbits or crushed nuts if the cook felt fancy. Once firm, it was unmolded with a flourish, its neon hue daringly bright against the muted tones of roast meats and mashed potatoes. It was called a salad, though the only greenery came from the gelatin's artificial coloring. And yet, for decades, it held pride of place at family dinners, church socials, and holiday buffets. Part of its appeal was texture. The surprising crunch of carrots suspended in sweet wobble, or perhaps the thrill of contrast. Dessert masquerading as a side dish. In an age when gelatin molds were culinary status symbols, the carrot Jell-O salad became an every woman's entry point into domestic showmanship. It was cheap, cheerful, and nearly impossible to ruin. Today, the dish feels more kitsch than cutting edge, often revived, ironically, at themed parties or lovingly defended by those who grew up with it. But take a bite, and you might understand why it endured. The tang of lime against earthy carrot, the refreshing chill alongside rich casseroles. It's a relic, yes, but also a reminder that food can be playful, even when it straddles the line between salad and dessert. Do we laugh at it now or secretly miss it? Maybe both. Grandma's vinegar pie, dessert born of empty pantries and infinite creativity. Long before grocery aisles overflowed with citrus and chocolate, rural kitchens faced a harsher reality. Sugar was precious, eggs were rationed, and fruit, especially lemons, was seasonal luxury. Out of that scarcity came vinegar pie, a dessert that feels like alchemy. At first glance, the idea seems absurd. Pie flavored with vinegar? But taste it once and you'll understand why generations of farm wives swore by it. In a world of empty cupboards, this humble pie managed to mimic a lemon custard tart, bright and tangy, without a single lemon in sight. The filling begins with pantry basics: sugar, eggs, butter, water, and a splash of plain vinegar, usually apple cider or white. When whisked together and baked in a flaky crust, the vinegar's sharpness softens, leaving behind a gentle tartness that cuts through the sweetness. A pinch of nutmeg or cinnamon often join the mix, lending warmth to what was otherwise an austere creation. Served plain or dusted with powdered sugar, it was proof that thrift didn't mean going without pleasure. This pie earned its place on Depression-era and pioneer tables, carried forward by oral tradition rather than glossy cookbooks. It was a testament to kitchen ingenuity, the kind of dessert that stretched meager supplies into something celebratory. Families would gather around the table, forks in hand, savoring each bite not just for its flavor, but for what it represented: survival sweetened with hope. Today, vinegar pie feels almost rebellious in its simplicity. In a culinary world obsessed with abundance, exotic spices, imported fruits, elaborate techniques, it offers a reminder that creativity often blooms in constraint. Bake one now and you'll taste history, a bright, custardy filling with an echo of lemon, resting in a buttery crust. It may not dazzle at first glance, but give it a chance. You might find yourself falling for this unassuming relic of America's frugal past and realizing Grandma knew exactly what she was doing all along. Egg and rice breakfast skillet for dinner. The ultimate breakfast for supper, born of rationing. In the lean years of the 1930s and 1940s, when every scrap of food had to stretch and ration books dictated dinner plans, American families learned to rethink mealtime. Breakfast foods, cheap, filling, and familiar, often made surprise appearances at the supper table. Few dishes capture that improvisational spirit better than the egg and rice breakfast skillet, a one-pan wonder that turned leftovers into comfort. The beauty of this dish lay in its frugality. Cold rice from yesterday's meal became the canvas, sautéed in a bit of bacon grease or butter until toasty and fragrant. Onions or any stray vegetable might be added, not for luxury, but because wasting food simply wasn't an option. Then came the eggs, beaten or cracked straight into the pan, scrambled loosely into the rice, or left sunny side up on top, their golden yolks turning the humble grains into something indulgent. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings needed, though a splash of milk or sprinkle of cheese, if available, could elevate the skillet to something bordering on celebratory. Families didn't call it fusion or minimalist cooking back then. It was simply what you did to feed everyone without complaint. And yet, despite its practicality, there's an undeniable coziness in the memory. The clatter of a single cast iron skillet on the stove, the smell of eggs and rice mingling in the air, children eager at the table because breakfast at night felt like a treat. Even after rationing ended, the egg and rice skillet endured. It remained a weeknight standby for busy parents, a college student's midnight meal, a quiet nod to the notion that comfort doesn't always require ceremony. Today, when breakfast for dinner resurfaces as a culinary trend, this dish stands as its unassuming ancestor, a reminder that sometimes the simplest meals, born of necessity, are the ones we crave most. Wouldn't you eat this tonight? No questions asked. Hamburger salad with French dressing, pre-fast food innovation. Before drive-through burgers and super-sized combos defined American convenience food, there was the humble hamburger salad, a dish that blended thrift, protein, and a surprising amount of flair. Born in the 1940s and 1950s, when home cooks stretched meat rations and balanced post-war optimism with lingering frugality, this salad was less about dieting and more about ingenuity. It was the hamburger reimagined for the family table, minus the bun, but rich in the flavors everyone craved. Ground beef formed the backbone, browned in a skillet with onions until savory and crumbly. Instead of nestling between slices of bread, the meat was scattered over a bed of crisp iceberg lettuce or shredded cabbage, the kind that came cheap and stayed fresh for weeks in the icebox. Additions varied, sometimes diced tomatoes, grated carrots, or even hard-boiled eggs, whatever the pantry offered. But the true star was the French dressing, tangy, slightly sweet, and brilliantly orange, often homemade from ketchup, vinegar, and oil whisked together in a mason jar. Its bold flavor tied everything together, coating the beef and greens in a way that felt hearty yet refreshing. Served chilled or at room temperature, hamburger salad became a fixture at church potlucks, school luncheons, and weeknight dinners when time and money were equally tight. It was portable, customizable, and perhaps most importantly, familiar. Families recognize the taste of a hamburger even without the trimmings, a small comfort during uncertain times. Today, the salad reads almost prophetic. Long before deconstructed burgers appeared on trendy menus, this dish captured the same idea, the essence of a burger, simplified and served in a bowl. It's retro, yes, but also practical. A perfect compromise between indulgence and thrift. One forkful, tangy dressing dripping down crisp lettuce and savory beef, and you'll understand why it deserves a quiet comeback. Would you eat it for dinner? Or call it lunch and not tell a soul? Cabbage roll, casserole, using leftover rice and soup. Frugal Eastern European comfort. Cabbage rolls with their tender leaves wrapped snugly around rice and meat have been a staple of Eastern European kitchens for generations. But when time, energy, or resources were scarce, something all too common during the Great Depression and post-war years, the casserole version became a savior. It captured the soul of the dish without the fuss of rolling, relying on two humble pantry heroes: leftover rice and a can of condensed soup. The process was ingenious in its thrift. Day-old rice, already cooked and slightly dry, was perfect for soaking up flavor. Ground beef or pork, sometimes stretched with breadcrumbs or extra vegetables, was browned with onions before being layered with chopped cabbage. Then came the magic. A can of tomato soup, or sometimes cream of tomato, poured over the top, thinned with a splash of water or broth. Seasonings were simple: salt, pepper, perhaps a pinch of paprika for warmth. Baked low and slow, the cabbage softened, the flavors mingled, and what emerged from the oven was bubbling, hearty comfort food. Unlike the meticulous hand-rolled version, This casserole fed a crowd with minimal effort. It often appeared at church suppers, weeknight dinners, or any occasion where frugality met hunger. Families who grew up on it still remember the smell, that tang of cabbage and tomato drifting from the kitchen, signaling a meal that felt both familiar and filling. Today, food trends might dress it up with fresh herbs, artisanal broths, or long-simmered sauces. But there's something honest about the version built from leftovers and a single can of soup. It's not trying to impress, it's trying to nourish. And in that way, it succeeds completely. One bite of tender cabbage, rich meat, and saucy rice, and you'll understand why this casserole has endured quietly for decades. Wouldn't you gladly eat this on a cold Sunday night, no questions asked? Victory Garden Stew, root vegetable and barley. Straight from 1940s cookbooks. In the 1940s, as war rationing reshaped American kitchens, ingenuity sprouted not just in pantries, but in backyards. Victory gardens, modest plots of carrots, turnips, potatoes, and whatever else would grow, became a patriotic duty and a lifeline. Out of these gardens came humble, hearty meals like Victory Garden Stew, a dish that didn't rely on rationed meat but still managed to fill bellies and warm spirits. This stew was built around what was available, which often meant root vegetables. Potatoes and carrots formed the base, joined by parsnips or rutabagas if the soil had been generous. Onions were sautéed first, not in butter, too precious, but in a drizzle of saved bacon fat or a splash of vegetable oil. Into the pot went diced vegetables, a bay leaf if one was handy, and handfuls of barley, a grain cheap enough to stretch meager portions into something substantial. Water or weak broth covered everything, simmering low until the barley swelled and the vegetables softened into a rustic, brothy comfort. Unlike rich pre-war stews heavy with beef, this was vegetable forward by necessity. Meat, if used at all, appeared as scraps, perhaps a bone saved from Sunday dinner, or a few shreds of salt pork to deepen flavor. Seasonings were sparse but clever. Salt and pepper, maybe a pinch of dried thyme or parsley saved from summer's drying racks. The flavor came not from luxury but from time. The slow simmer coaxed sweetness from roots and earthiness from grain. Served with homemade bread or cornbread, Victory Garden Stew became a weeknight staple, its simplicity celebrated rather than lamented. It fed families, nourished soldiers overseas through thrift, and proved that wartime cooking could still taste like home. Today, ladling out a bowl feels like stepping into history, a reminder of resilience and the quiet heroism of everyday meals. Wouldn't it be worth reviving, even in peacetime? Chicken fried steak with white gravy, Southern Sunday royalty. Few dishes command a Sunday table in the South quite like chicken fried steak. Despite the name, there's no chicken involved. Just tenderized beef, usually a humble cut like cube steak, pounded thin and transformed into something worthy of a feast. Its magic lies in the double comfort of crispy breading and creamy white gravy, a pairing so beloved it's practically canonized in Southern cookbooks. The ritual begins with the meat. Tough cuts were chosen not out of preference but practicality. They were cheap, available, and forgiving once bathed in seasoned flour. Each steak was dredged, dipped in egg, dredged again, then fried in hot oil, often in a cast iron skillet seasoned from generations of use. The sizzle filled the kitchen with promise, each golden crust forming the perfect canvas for what came next. The gravy. White gravy, or milk gravy to many Southerners, is simplicity itself. Pan drippings whisked with flour, then loosened with milk until smooth and luxuriously thick. Black pepper was mandatory, speckling the sauce and adding a faint bite to cut through the richness. Spoon it generously over the steak, letting it spill onto mashed potatoes or biscuits waiting on the plate. This wasn't just dinner, it was ritual, indulgence made from thrift. On Sundays, chicken fried steak often signaled something special: post-church gatherings, family reunions, or payday splurges. It was hearty enough to quiet hunger, yet familiar enough to feel like home, bridging generations at the table. Children learned early to chase every drop of gravy with a torn-off biscuit, while adults savored the crackle of crust against tender beef. Today, the dish endures beyond nostalgia. It appears on diner menus and holiday spreads, cherished not just for its flavor, but for the story it tells. Of Southern cooks turning tough cuts into royalty, of comfort born from necessity. One bite, creamy and crisp, and you understand why this remains Sunday's reigning champion. Wouldn't you crown it too? Salmon patties with white sauce. Pantry seafood gone gourmet. Canned edition. Before fresh salmon fillets appeared shrink-wrapped in supermarket coolers, most home cooks met this fish in its humble canned form. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, canned salmon was a Depression and wartime staple, ready to be transformed into something greater than the sum of its parts. Among the many dishes it inspired, salmon patties, sometimes called salmon cakes or croquettes, stood out as the crown jewel, especially when crowned with a ladle of simple white sauce. The recipe was born from thrift but whispered of elegance. Flaked canned salmon, bones and all, was mixed with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, a beaten egg for binding, and a splash of milk or broth to keep it tender. Onion or celery might sneak in for flavor, but nothing fancy. Just what the pantry allowed. Formed into patties, they were fried in butter or shortening until golden and crisp at the edges, the sizzle promising a meal far more luxurious than its humble origin suggested. The white sauce, a basic bechamel by another name, completed the transformation. Butter melted in a saucepan, flour whisked in to form a roux, milk added gradually until the mixture thickened to velvety perfection. Seasoned simply with salt and pepper, perhaps a hint of lemon or parsley if available, it was poured over the patties, softening their crust and adding a creamy counterpoint to the briny salmon. These patties graced countless dinner tables during the 1930s through the 1950s, often served with mashed potatoes, peas, or plain white bread. For families living far from coasts, they were a rare taste of the sea, accessible luxury born from a tin can. Today, salmon patties still appear in family cookbooks and diner menus, a relic of frugal creativity that remains surprisingly modern. One bite of that crispy exterior meeting creamy sauce, and you'll see why this pantry seafood has never truly gone out of style. Wouldn't you call that gourmet? Bisquick coffee cake with nutmeg, the shortcut dessert. Mom swore was homemade. In the golden age of convenience cooking, few pantry staples transformed American kitchens quite like Bisquick. This humble yellow box promised biscuits, pancakes, and cobblers at a moment's notice. And among its most beloved creations was the coffee cake, A dessert so quick and forgiving, it felt almost magical. Add a pinch of nutmeg, and suddenly that shortcut tasted like something Grandma might have made from scratch. The beauty of the Bisquick coffee cake lay in its simplicity. A few scoops of mix, an egg, some milk and sugar. No sifting, no yeast, no hours of rising. The batter poured thick into a pan, waiting for its crowning glory. A streusel topping of butter, cinnamon, brown sugar, and that all-important nutmeg. Baked until golden, it emerged soft and tender beneath a crackly, sweet crust, filling the kitchen with a scent that rivaled any bakery. This cake wasn't reserved for birthdays or holidays. It was the company's coming cake. The Sunday morning cake, the dessert Mom could whip together between phone calls and laundry. In an era when women balanced wartime frugality with post-war optimism, Bisquick offered the illusion of homemade without the labor, a miracle in a box, if you ask the advertisers. Nutmeg gave it character, a warm, slightly mysterious note that elevated the cake beyond its humble ingredients. It paired perfectly with coffee, of course, but also with milk at bedtime or tea on a rainy afternoon. Sliced warm from the pan, it rarely lasted past the first pot of percolated coffee. Today, scratch recipes abound, but there's something deeply nostalgic about the Bisquick version. It's fast, it's forgiving, and it tastes like childhood mornings at a Formica table. Sunlight catching on a sugar-dusted top. Make one now, and you might find yourself defending it too. Of course it's homemade, Mom said so. Tuna noodle casserole with potato chips. Predecessor of TikTok. Crunch topping trends. Long before the internet discovered that every dish benefits from a crunchy topping, mid-century home cooks were already masters of the concept. Enter the tuna noodle casserole, that creamy, budget-friendly classic crowned with a layer of crushed potato chips. It was the kind of dish that could stretch a can of tuna into a family meal and still feel miraculously like comfort food. Born in the 1940s and 50s, when canned goods ruled pantries and convenience reigned supreme, the recipe was as practical as it was forgiving. Cooked egg noodles formed the base, tossed with a can of cream of mushroom soup and a splash of milk to create its signature silky sauce. In went flaked tuna, drained, affordable, and widely available, plus a scattering of frozen peas if someone wanted to claim it counted as a vegetable. Everything was stirred together in one bowl, poured into a casserole dish, and blanketed with crushed potato chips for the grand finale. The chips weren't just garnish. They were genius. They turned soft, creamy noodles into something texturally exciting, their salty crunch cutting through the richness of the casserole beneath. Kids fought for the corner pieces where chips browned deepest, while parents quietly appreciated a topping that required no extra effort. Tuna noodle casserole became a fixture at potlucks, weeknight dinners, and post-church suppers, cheap, filling, and nearly impossible to mess up. It carried families through lean times, yet somehow never felt like a compromise. Even its scent, warm soup, noodles, and toasted chips mingling in the oven, signaled comfort to anyone who walked through the door. Today, TikTok may reinvent crunch toppings with panko or hot honey potato chips, but this casserole was doing it first and without irony. Bake one now and you'll taste why it endured. Creamy, salty, crunchy, and unfussy in the best way. Isn't it time we stopped calling it outdated and admitted it's timeless? Meatloaf with ketchup glaze and oatmeal filler. Once a badge of frugality, Now comfort food nostalgia. Few dishes better capture the story of mid-century American kitchens than meatloaf. At its heart, it was a survival recipe, born of the need to stretch precious ground beef into something that could feed an entire family. Oats or torn breadcrumbs bulked out the mixture, eggs bound it together, and onions, salt, and pepper provided just enough seasoning to keep things interesting. Into a loaf pan it went, destined to become both weeknight workhorse and Sunday centerpiece. The most iconic version wore a ruby red crown of ketchup glaze. Brushed thick across the top before baking, the ketchup caramelized in the oven's heat, transforming into a tangy sweet crust that kids adored and parents quietly relied upon to mask the humble ingredients within. It was both practical and showy, a thrifty meal dressed up for the dinner table. During the Great Depression and into the 1940s, meatloaf represented resourcefulness. Cooks combined beef with oatmeal not out of culinary whimsy but necessity. It stretched protein, absorbed juices, and kept the loaf tender. In post-war years, when convenience foods flooded markets, meatloaf adapted seamlessly, embracing canned soups, powdered onion mix, and whatever pantry shortcuts made life easier for busy homemakers. Yet even as America's tastes evolved toward fancier roasts and restaurant fare, meatloaf remained stubbornly beloved. It showed up in school cafeterias, church suppers, and family cookbooks, quietly comforting through generations. Leftovers tucked into sandwiches the next day became their own small joy, the ketchup glaze mingling with soft white bread. Today, chefs might dress it up with artisanal glazes or gourmet blends of meats, but the nostalgia remains strongest for the original: humble beef, filler oats, and that unmistakable ketchup topping. One bite, and you're back at a Formica table, mashed potatoes on the side, green beans from a can, and a sense that just for tonight, everything is right with the world. Souffle pie, molasses magic of Pennsylvania Dutch Sundays. Souffle pie is one of those desserts that seems almost mythical, born from thrift, rooted in tradition, and named with a wink. Originating among the Pennsylvania Dutch in the late 1800s, it was built around one ingredient many farm families always had on hand: molasses. Dark, sticky, and inexpensive, molasses transformed what might have been a plain sugar pie into something deep, rich, and unmistakably rustic. Its curious name? Some say it came from the way flies hovered over the sweet filling as it cooled on windowsills. Souffle. Unlike custard or fruit pies, souffle pie relies on simplicity. The filling is a blend of molasses, hot water, and baking soda, thickened slightly with flour and sometimes an egg. On top goes a crumb mixture: flour, sugar, and butter rubbed together until sandy. As the pie bakes, the crumbs form a delicate crust, while the filling bubbles into a sticky sweet layer beneath. There are two main styles: wet bottom with a gooey molasses center, and dry bottom, more cake-like throughout. Both are unapologetically old-fashioned. This pie wasn't just dessert, it was sustenance. Eaten at breakfast with coffee or as a Sunday treat after church, it provided energy for long days in the fields and comfort in lean seasons. The Pennsylvania Dutch prized it not only for its flavor, but for its longevity. Souffle pie could sit out for days without spoiling, making it ideal for farmhouses where refrigeration was a luxury. Today, souffle pie survives as both regional icon and nostalgia trip. Bakeries in Lancaster County still serve it to curious tourists, while locals quietly enjoy it the way their grandparents did. Cut thick, served plain, no frills required. One forkful of that dark molasses sweetness, tempered by buttery crumbs, and you're tasting history itself. Isn't it remarkable how something so simple can linger for centuries? Chicken and dumplings, drop style. Stretching one chicken into a feast. Before supermarkets promised endless boneless cuts, a single chicken had to do heavy lifting in the family kitchen. From Sunday roasts to weekday soups, thrifty cooks learned to stretch every part, bones, skin, and scraps included. Chicken and dumplings, especially the drop-style version, turned that resourcefulness into pure comfort, transforming one modest bird into a meal that could feed an entire table. The process began with a simmering pot. A whole chicken, often the last from the backyard coop, was boiled gently with onions, celery, and carrots until the meat was tender and the broth rich with golden fat. Once cooled, the chicken was shredded, every morsel counted, and returned to the pot. The vegetables stayed too, thickening the stew with their softened edges and lending sweetness to the savory broth. The magic came with the dumplings. Unlike the rolled noodle-like versions popular in some regions, drop dumplings required no precision. Just a simple batter of flour, baking powder, milk, and fat mixed until sticky. Spoonfuls were dropped directly into the bubbling broth, puffing up as they cooked. Soft yet hearty, these dumplings soaked up flavor while adding body to the dish, turning broth into a meal. For many families, this wasn't just supper, it was ritual. The pot stayed on the stove, feeding farmhands at midday and children at supper time with biscuits or cornbread on the side if flour allowed. In hard times, more dumplings than chicken stretched the pot further. In good times, extra butter made it luxurious. Either way, it felt like abundance. Today, chicken and dumplings remain a Southern and Midwestern staple, though recipes vary wildly. Some insist on buttermilk, others on herbs. But the essence endures. Thrift turned delicious. A dish that tastes like home no matter where you eat it. One spoonful, tender chicken, fluffy dumpling, steam rising, and you'll understand why this humble stew has outlasted generations of food fads. Wouldn't you call that timeless comfort? Apple dumplings with hard sauce, simple orchard sweetness with pantry staples. Few desserts evoke early American kitchens quite like apple dumplings, those tender pastries cradling spiced fruit and baked until syrupy. They emerged from a time when fall orchards overflowed and nothing was wasted, not even bruised apples that wouldn't last through winter storage. Wrapped in biscuit dough and baked in cast iron skillets or enamel pans, dumplings turned humble fruit into something celebratory, especially when paired with hard sauce. A sugary, buttery confection that melted luxuriously over the warm pastry. The dumpling itself was straightforward. Apples, often peeled but sometimes left rustic, were cored and filled with a simple mixture of sugar, cinnamon, and butter. Each was then enveloped in biscuit or pie dough, pinched closed at the top like a rustic parcel, baked in a shallow syrup of water, sugar, and more butter. They emerged bubbling and golden, the sauce caramelizing around the edges. The result was both pie and pudding, soft fruit inside flaky crust, a dessert designed for families who needed comfort as much as sweetness. Hard sauce, despite its name, wasn't hard at all. It was a beaten mixture of butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla, or, for festive occasions, a splash of rum or brandy, creamed until light and fluffy. Served cold, it melted instantly upon contact with the hot dumpling, cooling into every crevice. For children, it was pure sweetness. For adults, a reminder that simple ingredients could feel indulgent. This dessert was a fixture at harvest suppers and Sunday dinners, an emblem of frugality that somehow felt luxurious. Even when money was tight, apples were plentiful, flour was cheap, and butter, though rationed at times, could be stretched for something special. Today, apple dumplings remain a nostalgic favorite, often rediscovered at county fairs or in family cookbooks smudged with cinnamon. One bite, warm pastry, spiced fruit, melting sauce, and you taste more than dessert. You taste orchards, autumn kitchens, and the quiet genius of making do. Isn't that sweetness worth bringing back? Beef and noodles over mashed potatoes. Double carb bliss from the Midwest. In the Midwest, comfort food isn't just a meal, it's a philosophy. Few dishes embody that ethos better than beef and noodles served over mashed potatoes. A hearty, double-starch wonder that raises eyebrows outside the region but feels like pure common sense to those who grew up with it. Why settle for one carb when you can have two? This dish traces its roots to farm kitchens where practicality ruled. Tough cuts of beef, often chuck roast or stew meat, were simmered low and slow until fork tender, perfuming the house with the kind of aroma that makes you linger by the stove. The broth, rich with beef drippings and onions, became the base for thick, homemade egg noodles. Rolled, cut, and tossed into the bubbling pot, the noodles soaked up every drop of flavor as they cooked, transforming into something closer to dumplings than delicate pasta. Meanwhile, mashed potatoes waited in a heaping bowl, creamy and buttery, ready to act as both plate and sponge. When the beef and noodles were ladled over top, the combination became almost decadent. Silky gravy mingling with soft potatoes, tender beef melting into chewy noodles. It was stick-to-your-ribs fare built for long winters and long workdays, meant to feed a crowd without fuss. Sunday dinners often featured this dish, especially after church or during harvest season when appetites were big and energy was low. Leftovers, if there were any, were scooped into bowls and reheated on the stovetop, arguably even better the next day as the noodles absorbed more of the broth. Today, beef and noodles over mashed potatoes might look like an indulgence, but in its time, it was pure practicality. Affordable cuts, homemade noodles, and a double dose of filling starch. One bite, and you understand why Midwesterners still swear by it. Call it excessive or call it genius. Either way, it's the kind of meal that makes you grateful for elastic waistbands and second helpings. Homemade egg noodles with chicken broth, grandmother's therapy in rolling pin form. Some recipes aren't just food, they're gestures of care. Homemade egg noodles simmered in chicken broth belong squarely in that category. A dish handed down through generations where love was measured not in cups or teaspoons, but in the time spent at the kitchen table, rolling pin in hand. Before packaged pasta and box soup mixes, this was how families coaxed nourishment and comfort out of simple staples. The noodles began with nothing fancy. Flour, eggs, a pinch of salt, maybe a splash of milk. Grandmothers mixed the dough by feel, kneading until smooth. then rolled it thin on floured boards worn soft by decades of use. The soft slap of dough against wood, the rhythmic swish of the rolling pin. These sounds were as soothing as the meal itself. Strips were cut with a paring knife, left rustic and uneven, then dusted with more flour so they wouldn't cling to one another. Meanwhile, a pot of chicken broth simmered on the stove, usually from a stewing hen or Sunday's leftover carcass. Carrots, celery, and onions gave it body. Salt and pepper, restraint. When the noodles hit the bubbling broth, they thickened it slightly, releasing a cloud of starch and soaking up its savory essence. 15 minutes later, you had a pot of golden comfort. Tender noodles suspended in rich broth, the kitchen filled with steam and the unmistakable smell of home. This dish wasn't reserved for company or holidays. It was for fevers, gray days, and quiet suppers, when words weren't enough, but a warm bowl might be. It bridged generations, teaching children patience and thrift, anchoring family tables long before comfort food became a trend. Today, homemade egg noodles are often replaced by store-bought shortcuts, yet nothing compares to the tactile therapy of making them by hand. Taste one slurp, and you'll understand why. This isn't just broth and noodles. It's memory, comfort, and love, rolled thin and simmered to perfection. Baked macaroni and tomatoes, the unsung pre-cheese mac dish. Before macaroni and cheese stole the spotlight, there was another baked pasta dish that graced American tables: macaroni and tomatoes. Humble, hearty, and surprisingly satisfying, it was a staple long before cheese became cheap enough to stir into every casserole. This dish emerged during the Depression and lingered through wartime rationing, proving that comfort didn't always require dairy or extravagance. Just pantry staples and a hot oven. The recipe was deceptively simple. Elbow macaroni, boiled until tender, was tossed with canned stewed tomatoes or crushed tomatoes, sometimes stretched with a splash of tomato juice. A little butter or bacon grease softened the acidity, while salt, pepper, and perhaps a pinch of sugar rounded out the flavor. Onions or green peppers might appear if the cook was feeling ambitious, but the beauty of this dish lay in its minimalism. The mixture was poured into a baking dish, dotted with more butter, and baked until the edges crisped and the top caramelized slightly. Families loved it because it was filling, affordable, and endlessly adaptable. Leftover bacon crumbles? Toss them in. A handful of breadcrumbs? Scatter them on top. Some cooks even added a sprinkle of grated cheese when they could spare it, though purists argue the tomato-forward simplicity is what makes it shine. For many, this was weekday fare, served with cornbread, fried potatoes, or nothing more than a glass of sweet tea. It also doubled as a meatless Friday meal for Catholic households, or a side dish at church suppers where casseroles ruled the table. Its tangy, sweet profile made it equally welcome alongside fried chicken or pork chops, proof that thrift could be flavorful. Today, baked macaroni and tomatoes feels almost forgotten, overshadowed by its cheesier cousin. Yet one bite of those tender noodles bathed in tomatoes' bright acidity, with crisped edges from the oven, and nostalgia hits hard. It's proof that not every comfort food needs cheese to earn its place in memory or on the plate. Hot water, cornbread, and brown gravy. Depression-era South on a plate. In the rural South of the 1930s, where cash was scarce and cornmeal was plentiful, Survival meant transforming humble ingredients into meals that could comfort as well as sustain. Hot water cornbread with brown gravy is perhaps the clearest expression of that ingenuity, a dish born of necessity, remembered now with quiet reverence. It wasn't fancy, but it filled bellies and soothed spirits during the hardest of times. The cornbread was unlike the tall, fluffy loaves many picture today. It began with plain cornmeal, salt, and boiling water. No milk, no eggs, nothing that couldn't be spared. The scalding water softened the meal, creating a thick batter that could be patted into small cakes. These were fried in a thin slick of lard or saved bacon grease until golden, crisp on the outside and tender within. Hot water cornbread was fast, frugal, and deeply satisfying, especially eaten straight from the skillet. The brown gravy it was paired with came from pan drippings, pork, beef, or even just onions browned in fat. A spoonful of flour stirred into the sizzling drippings, followed by water or weak broth, transformed scraps into sauce. The result was rich, savory, and just salty enough to make the plain cornbread sing. For families with no meat to serve, this combination became dinner. Crispy cakes dunked into steaming gravy, eaten by hand if plates were scarce. This meal carried cultural weight too. It anchored suppers after long days in the fields, appeared at revival meetings and family gatherings, and offered small comfort during the Great Depression's uncertainty. Children grew up remembering its smell, the cornmeal sizzling in hot fat, the gravy thickening in a cast iron pan as the aroma of home. Today, hot water cornbread and brown gravy survive as soul food classics, often revived at family reunions or Southern diners that honor old traditions. One bite, and you taste resilience. Humble ingredients transformed by skill, love, and the promise that even the leanest meal can still feel abundant. Wouldn't you pass down that recipe too? Cold macaroni salad with Miracle Whip, the 1970s fancy picnic essential. Few dishes capture the spirit of 1970s American picnics quite like cold macaroni salad, especially when dressed with Miracle Whip. In an era when convenience foods ruled the pantry and backyard potlucks reigned supreme, this creamy, sweet, tangy pasta salad felt downright fancy. It was portable, cheap, and endlessly adaptable, yet still carried the air of something special when placed on a picnic table beside fried chicken and deviled eggs. At its core, the salad was simplicity itself. Elbow macaroni, chosen for its ability to trap dressing in every curve, was boiled until tender, rinsed cool, and tossed with chopped celery, onions, and often bell peppers for crunch and color. Miracle Whip, with its unmistakable sweetness and vinegar bite, bound everything together, transforming humble noodles into something craveable. A splash of pickle juice or a spoonful of mustard might sneak in, depending on the cook's loyalties, but the base formula rarely wavered. What made this dish feel fancy in its day was the way it dressed up basic ingredients for company. Hard-boiled eggs or canned pimentos added pops of color. Sometimes diced ham or peas joined in for heartiness. Chilled in Tupperware, it became the perfect companion to church picnics, neighborhood barbecues, or road trips where coolers rattled in the back seat. The bright, slightly sweet dressing stood up to summer heat and salty, fried foods alike, making it a guaranteed crowd pleaser. For many families, this macaroni salad was a generational hand-me-down. Its proportions rarely written but always remembered. Aunts and grandmothers made it by feel, tasting as they stirred until it looked right, That intuitive approach, paired with Miracle Whip's signature flavor, cemented it as a nostalgic staple. Today, mayonnaise may dominate modern recipes, but for those who grew up on the original, nothing else tastes quite like summer. One bite, cold pasta, crunchy vegetables, that tangy sweet dressing, and suddenly, you're back at a folding table under the shade of an elm tree, paper plate in hand, fireflies just starting to appear. Barbecue meatballs, grape jelly and chili sauce. Crock-pot party hero. Few party foods say Midwestern potluck, quite like a crock pot full of barbecue meatballs simmering in grape jelly and chili sauce. Equal parts sweet, tangy, and nostalgic, this dish rose to fame in the 1960s and 1970s when home cooks discovered that two unlikely pantry staples, grape jelly and bottled chili sauce, could combine into something far greater than the sum of their parts. Toss in frozen or homemade meatballs, set it to low, and you had the kind of appetizer that vanished faster than you could refill toothpicks. The recipe was brilliantly simple, which is exactly why it became a party hero. A jar of grape jelly, usually the cheapest store brand, brought sticky sweetness, while Heinz chili sauce, ketchup's zippier cousin, added tang and spice. Together, they created a glossy glaze that clung to every meatball, transforming humble ground beef into cocktail hour gold. No measuring, no fuss, just pour, stir, and let time do the rest. This dish thrived in the age of slow cookers, when hostesses prized recipes that could be assembled ahead of time and ignored until guests arrived. It wasn't uncommon to see several crock pots lined up at holiday buffets or church suppers, each bubbling with meatballs destined to disappear long before dessert. They weren't just food. They were social glue, fueling conversations and second helpings without breaking the bank. While purists swear by the original two-ingredient sauce, variations soon emerged. Some cooks swapped grape jelly for apricot or cranberry, added Worcestershire for depth, or tossed in a splash of hot sauce for heat. But the heart of the dish remained the same. Frugal ingredients turned into something surprisingly addictive. Today, barbecue meatballs live on as retro party royalty. They're still beloved for their ease, flavor, and sheer crowd-pleasing power. Proof that sometimes the oddest combinations endure the longest. One bite, sweet and tangy with just a whisper of heat, and you're instantly back in a church basement or holiday living room, napkin in hand, reaching for another. Pineapple glazed ham loaf, Midwestern, company's coming showpiece. Long before spiral cut hams became the default centerpiece, the ham loaf reigned as the Midwestern hostess's secret weapon. It was thrifty, practical, and when brushed with a gleaming pineapple glaze, downright celebratory. Equal parts ground ham and pork, this loaf turned what might have been scraps or leftover holiday ham into something worthy of the good china. Ham loaf emerged from a culture of making do, popular in Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens and throughout the rural Midwest. Rather than serving whole cuts of expensive cured ham, thrifty cooks ground their leftovers, mixing them with fresh pork, eggs, milk, and cracker crumbs for structure. Shaped into a loaf and baked until tender, it was both economical and indulgent, a clever way to stretch precious meat into multiple meals. The magic, however, came in the glaze. A mixture of brown sugar, vinegar, mustard, and canned pineapple juice, sometimes even topped with whole pineapple rings caramelized in the oven, basting the loaf in a sticky, sweet sheen. The result was a perfect balance of salty ham, tangy glaze, and tropical brightness that felt exotic for small-town kitchens of the 1950s and 60s. This was the dish you served when company's coming. It graced church suppers, Sunday dinners, and family reunions, often sliced thick alongside scalloped potatoes and green beans. Leftovers were equally prized, tucked into sandwiches with a swipe of mustard or reheated in the pan drippings for weekday lunches. Though ham loaf has faded from modern tables, replaced by flashier roasts and convenience meats, it remains a quiet classic in community cookbooks and family recipe boxes. One bite of that sweet, salty crust and soft, savory interior transports you back to linoleum-floored kitchens and wood-paneled dining rooms, where pineapple rings were the height of sophistication and thrift was its own kind of culinary genius. Isn't it time this company's coming star reclaimed its place at the table? Creamed chipped beef on toast, SOS. Military fare turned family breakfast for dinner. Few dishes carry as much cultural baggage and nostalgia as creamed chipped beef on toast. Known affectionately or begrudgingly as SOS in military slang, stuff on a shingle to keep it polite. This humble combination of dried beef and white sauce fed soldiers through 2 world wars and countless barracks breakfasts. It was cheap, filling, and required little more than shelf-stable ingredients and a hot griddle. At its core, SOS is simplicity itself. Thin slices of dried or chipped beef simmered in a creamy bechamel sauce, generously seasoned with black pepper and poured over crisp toast. The beef, salty and slightly chewy, was often surplus or ration stock, and the gravy stretched it into a meal hearty enough for long days of drills or deployments. For many servicemen, it was either a comfort or a culinary punchline. Loved by some, cursed by others, yet impossible to forget. After the wars, returning soldiers brought the dish home where frugal housewives embraced it as an easy breakfast for dinner option. Pantry-friendly and endlessly adaptable, it appeared in 1950s kitchens atop toast, biscuits, or even potatoes. Some families dressed it up with extra milk for a thinner sauce. Others added paprika or parsley for color, but the essence remained unchanged. Salty meat, creamy gravy, and something crisp beneath. By the 1960s and 70s, creamed chipped beef had become diner fare, comforting and unpretentious. It carried the nostalgia of military service and the warmth of home kitchens, especially for families who grew up hearing stories of Army food that, truth be told, tasted far better at mom's table. Today, SOS is often rediscovered as retro comfort food. Less a joke, more a reminder of how thrift and necessity birthed enduring traditions. One forkful of creamy sauce seeping into toast, and you understand why, for all its humble origins, this dish refuses to disappear. Its history you can taste, equal parts grit and comfort. Pantry pasta with tuna and mayo, cheap, fast, and divisive. Few dishes spark more passionate kitchen debates than pantry pasta with tuna and mayo. To some, it's a lifesaver, cheap, quick, and satisfying in its creamy simplicity. To others, it's culinary heresy, pasta and mayonnaise in the same bowl. Yet for generations of frugal cooks, especially during lean years or sweltering summers, this dish wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about feeding a family with what was already in the cupboard. The recipe hardly needs a card. Cooked pasta, usually elbows or shells, was cooled under cold water, tossed with canned tuna, packed in water or oil, depending on what was cheapest, and bound together with mayonnaise. Chopped celery or onion might sneak in for crunch, a sprinkle of salt and pepper for balance, and if someone was feeling fancy, a handful of frozen peas. That was it. No oven, no fuss, and barely any cleanup. This dish thrived in eras of rationing and tight budgets. The Depression, the post-war boom, the 1970s inflation years, when tuna was abundant and shelf-stable. It also doubled as an easy make-ahead meal for picnics, church potlucks, or school lunches. Served chilled, it was both refreshing and filling, though its unapologetic reliance on mayonnaise made it as polarizing then as now. For many, pantry tuna pasta conjures memories of chipped Corelle bowls and hot kitchens where turning on the stove for more than 10 minutes felt unbearable. For kids, it was often a first introduction to salad that didn't involve lettuce. For parents, it was proof that dinner could appear on the table in under 15 minutes without a trip to the store. Today, food trends may favor olive oil tuna and artisanal aioli, but the essence remains unchanged. Salty fish, creamy dressing, and pasta to carry it all. One bite, cold, comforting, familiar, and you either sigh with nostalgia or swear never to speak of it again. That's the beauty of divisive dishes. Love them or hate them, they always leave an impression. Scalloped potatoes and ham, leftover magic. Stretching Sunday ham through Wednesday. Scalloped potatoes and ham might be the purest expression of Midwestern thrift. Take what's left of Sunday's glazed ham, bury it under layers of thin sliced potatoes, drown it in a simple white sauce, and bake until bubbling. It's not glamorous, but it's the kind of dish that quietly carries a family through the week, turning scraps into something that feels like comfort rather than compromise. The dish's genius lies in its simplicity. Potatoes, peeled and sliced paper thin, are layered with diced leftover ham, often just the bits clinging stubbornly to the bone. A basic white sauce, thickened with flour and milk, gets poured over the layers, sometimes seasoned with nothing more than salt, pepper, and a pinch of onion powder. Baked in a casserole dish until the edges turn golden and the potatoes soften to perfection, it emerges as the sort of meal that invites second helpings before it even leaves the oven. During the 1940s and 50s, when waste was unthinkable and refrigeration limited, this recipe became a staple. Ham bones had already flavored Monday's soup. What meat remained found new life here. It stretched protein across multiple meals without anyone feeling deprived. A quiet miracle for mothers feeding big families on tight budgets. The scent of scalloped potatoes and ham baking is almost as evocative as the taste. Earthy potatoes, smoky ham, and creamy sauce mingling into something both hearty and homey. It was a dish you could assemble in minutes, slide into the oven, and forget about until supper time. Ideal for busy weeknights when homework and laundry competed for attention. Today, scalloped potatoes and ham remain a favorite in church cookbooks and holiday leftover guides. Some modern versions add cheese, but the classic stands on its own. Proof that comfort doesn't need extravagance. One forkful of creamy potato and salty ham, and you're back at Grandma's table, grateful that Sunday's feast still has one more story to tell. Baked rice pudding with raisins, humble dessert with staying power. Few desserts better embody the phrase, waste not, want not, than baked rice pudding with raisins. Born in kitchens where leftover rice was too precious to discard, It transformed yesterday's starch into something sweet, comforting, and surprisingly elegant. It didn't require exotic spices or fancy techniques, just milk, sugar, eggs, and the magic of slow baking, turning ordinary grains into custard. The process was as practical as it was soothing. Cooked rice, often whatever lingered from supper, was stirred with milk and eggs, sweetened with sugar, and scented with vanilla or cinnamon if the pantry allowed. Raisins were folded in for bursts of sweetness, plumping as they baked. The mixture went into a buttered dish and into a low oven, where patience did the work. The top slowly bronzed, the edges set, and the center thickened into creamy comfort. This pudding thrived during lean times. The Great Depression, wartime rationing, and countless post-holiday Mondays saw frugal cooks turn spare rice and pantry staples into dessert without spending an extra dime. It was filling enough to double as breakfast, humble enough for weeknights, yet somehow special when sprinkled with nutmeg or served warm with a splash of cream. Children loved its soft texture and caramelized top. Adults appreciated its thrift and versatility. It traveled easily to church suppers or family reunions, baked in simple Pyrex dishes whose contents disappeared long before the potluck ended. Even cold from the refrigerator, it remained irresistible, a quiet companion to coffee or late-night cravings. Modern versions may swap raisins for dried cranberries or add orange zest for brightness, but the soul of the dish endures. It's less about perfection than about making do, about coaxing sweetness from scraps. One spoonful, warm, creamy, studded with raisins, and you're tasting more than dessert. You're tasting history, the resilience of cooks who knew that comfort could come from the simplest things. Isn't that worth remembering? Mock apple pie, using Ritz crackers, the most convincing culinary trick of the Great Depression. If necessity is the mother of invention, then mock apple pie might be her cleverest child. Born during the Great Depression and popularized through World War II, this pie used no apples at all, just Ritz crackers, sugar, and spices, to create a dessert so convincing that unsuspecting guests swore they were eating the real thing. It was equal parts frugality and sleight of hand, proof that resourceful cooks could conjure comfort from the humblest pantry items. The trick lay in the filling. Ritz crackers, with their buttery flavor and flaky texture, were arranged in a pie crust and doused with a syrup of water, sugar, and cream of tartar. A generous dusting of cinnamon and a squeeze of lemon mimicked the sweet tart flavor of cooked apples, while the crackers softened during baking, transforming into something remarkably similar to tender fruit slices. Topped with a second crust and baked until golden, it looked and smelled every bit like classic apple pie. This recipe wasn't about fooling people for the sake of novelty. It was about survival. Apples were scarce or expensive in many parts of the country during the 1930s and 40s, especially off-season. Ritz crackers, by contrast, were affordable, shelf-stable, and widely available. Nabisco even printed the recipe on its cracker boxes, turning an improvised trick into a beloved staple. Families embraced mock apple pie not just because it stretched budgets, but because it tasted good. Served warm with a scoop of ice cream or cold with a cup of coffee, it brought a sense of normalcy to tables otherwise defined by rationing and substitution. Today, mock apple pie endures as a curiosity, a nostalgic nod to a time when creativity in the kitchen was born of hardship, not foodie experimentation. But one bite of its sweet, spiced filling and flaky crust still surprises. It may be a trick, but it's an enduringly delicious one, proof that ingenuity has always had a place at the American table. So there you have it. 30 Sunday dishes that once ruled the family table and now live quietly in the pages of old church cookbooks. Which one do you remember? Which one deserves a comeback in your own kitchen? Tell me down in the comments. And if this trip down memory lane made you hungry or just made you smile, hit that like button, share it with someone who misses grandma's cooking, and subscribe for more forgotten recipes worth remembering.